Okay, hey everyone. Sorry we're getting started a little bit late. We were having some technical difficulties. We think we've worked out, but we'll give everybody a couple seconds to get in the room. We may have lost some people from being 6 minutes late, but we'll just give a few more seconds. Welcome to those that are joining. I think I know most of you on so far, but I'm Callie McNutt, Chair of the Birmingham Committee on Foreign Relations, and I'll wait a few seconds to introduce our guest speaker for today. And we're going to try to share a PowerPoint. We're going to do our best. So Joelle, you're joining us from Geneva.
Yes, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much, Callie. Callie, just so that you all know, Callie and I go way back. We used to live in New York City at the same time, and
I was in DC. I just came to visit.
Oh, right, you lived in DC. It's true, and we were a member of a foreign policy circle. We would attend many debates about all sorts of issues, and it was really wonderful. So thank you so much to Callie for enabling me to speak to you all tonight or today.
Wonderful. How's the weather in Geneva?
Sorry?
How's the weather in Geneva?
The weather is very dark. So we've changed our clocks and it's raining, it's gray, it's terrible. So I'm sure that the sun is with you at the moment in Birmingham.
It's nice right now. We finally started to get some fall weather. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I know we don't have many people on the call, but like I said, we sometimes we get more folks joining us after the fact. So this is being recorded and will be shared with our membership. We have about 100 members. But thank you, Joelle, for being with us today. Like all of you know, Joelle is a human rights expert living in Geneva and has done a ton of research on anti-blasphemy laws around the world. And it's a go-to expert on international religious freedom. And like she said, we know each other from circa probably 2012, running around the DC and New York foreign policy establishment groups. But she is, I know you've all seen her bio. She is are you a dual Swiss-British citizen, Joelle?
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. So maybe if you could start out, I think it's more interesting to hear kind of your story before we get into the policy and analysis and your research, your story of how you got into this work, kind of maybe what sparked your interest in human rights. Maybe it was something in your upbringing, but if you could kind of walk us through that and then tell us, because I know the European system sometimes is kind of complex for us Americans to understand, but I know that you're involved with the Geneva Parliament. So maybe if you could just tell us how you got to where you are, that'd be a great starting point.
Oh, goodness. Okay. So thank you so much. How did I get involved in religious freedom? Well, I realized quite quickly. So I was working in the European Parliament, which is a parliament of 27 member states of the European Union. And then I moved to New York and I worked for an organization called Human Rights First. And during that time, I would often go back to Geneva and work in the Human Rights Council, work on behalf of them to represent Human Rights First, this US non-governmental organization, to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And there were always these, tensions about religion. And, everybody knows that religion is, religion can bring out the best and the worst of people. It can be very soothing for the human individual. And at the same time, it's such a core, American value as well, religious freedom. The country was based on that. But at the same time, it can bring out the worst of people as well. And a lot of violence can be waged also in the name of religion. And so I started becoming very, very interested in this phenomenon of religion and how it can impact foreign relations and how it can impact societies around the world and democracies and the rule of law. And then when I came back to Geneva, to live here in 2014, after my stint in the US, where I learned a great deal, I learned so much in the United States. I came back here and I continued, working on these issues. And I notably consulted for the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan federal agency. And which is, very interesting because it's really one of the issues where Democrats and Republicans really agree on the importance of highlighting blasphemy allegations around the world and its impact. And so it was really wonderful to work in this bipartisan context where we could produce very interesting reports. And so I started writing reports for the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I came up with some findings that are really wonderful, because not only they can give you a global sense about how religion and blasphemy allegations around the world can impact foreign relations, but it can also provide you with some targeted advice on specific countries. So it's a great lens. I think religion is a great lens to understand a society as well. Not always, of course, there are many other indicators, but religion is one of them. And it's one that I've always thought is very interesting.
Wonderful. So I guess at this point, I can just turn the floor over to you, Joelle. Would you like for me to try and share your PowerPoint now, or wait until later? How do you want to do this?
No, let's definitely try and share it. That would be wonderful.
All right.
That would be great if it's possible. And
we're going to try.
I'm going to introduce to you all some findings of a report which was published. It was published. Oh, wonderful! It seems to work, which is fantastic. So this is basically the results of a wonderful cooperation between myself and the Human Rights Law Clinic at Cardozo Law School in New York. And what did we do, basically? What we did was to try and produce a snapshot in time to capture how states across the globe enforce their blasphemy laws. Now, just so that you know, I'm sure that you do know, but just in case you don't, the US doesn't have a blasphemy law, because the freedom of expression standards are very high in the US. You have to really, breach the First Amendment, incitement to imminent riot, to have your free speech curbed. And so, this is something does not concern the United States at all, but it does concern the rest of the world, where there are some laws that can criminalize you when you insult religion. And so if you click on the PowerPoint, you'll see, hopefully, what a criminal blasphemy law is, basically. What it is that it is an act that is deemed insulting to religion. So it can be all sorts of different things. It can be punishing individuals for insulting, for denigrating religious doctrines, denigrating religious symbols, disparaging the sacred, punishing individuals for wounding or insulting religious feelings. And so what we did is we took a time period of 5 years, basically between 2014 and 2018, and we looked across the world and we tried to see what states were doing to curb any commentary on religion that criminalizes individuals to comment on religion. And of course, religion, as we said, it's capable of the best and the worst, but it's so important for a society to breathe intellectually, to discuss ideas, to be able to discuss them without fear of repercussions. And unfortunately, in many countries around the world, it's very difficult to comment about religion at all out of fear of being persecuted. So what we did was we literally examined all the different state actions across 84 countries where there are laws during that 5-year period, and we inspected how the policemen were dealing with things, how security agents were acting upon blasphemy allegations, prison officials, security prosecutors, judges, lawyers, basically anybody who has some sort of state authority position that could impact this discussion. And so we noticed that there are lots of different ways for government officials to enforce these blasphemy laws. So they could immediately arrest somebody, for example, or use the blasphemy law in place to enforce what they deem is a blasphemous speech. Of course, what's strange about blasphemous speech is that, if you say the same thing to me or to Callie, we will be offended in different ways about what is said. Callie has her own she'll be offended for some things, I will be offended for others. And being offended, it's a very subjective notion. People are not offended in the same way. So the whole concept of being offended in international law, it's very murky. People are offended in different ways, basically. So what you can say to me and what you would say to Callie will trigger probably very different reactions. And this is precisely the problem. So if, for example, one policeman says, oh, this is blasphemous speech, you have insulted the sanctity of God, this could be that police officer who thinks that it's very offensive, but maybe another police officer in a similar situation, even in the same country, with the same culture and the same language, maybe that policeman wouldn't necessarily feel that that speech is deemed blasphemous from a legal point of view. So this is the whole problem of defining what blasphemy allegations are. So they can so this is, where government officials take an official role. Now, we really did find a treasure of findings, and unfortunately, I can't really tell them all to you today, but I do encourage you to read the report, and I do encourage you to send me as many questions as you want by email afterwards. Callie will share my email with you, and I would be delighted to share all sorts of information with you, and we can carry on a conversation. I'll actually try to reduce my presentation so that we can also have time for questions and answers. But before that, I just want to say that blasphemy allegations, it's often the tip of the iceberg when it comes to international religious freedom, because often these allegations, they actually occur in the context of situations where there's already violence around religious issues. So you have blasphemy allegations against the backdrop of bombings and assaults of places of worship, or desecration of religious sites, or hate crimes against individuals, instances of violence against minorities, physical assaults, verbal attacks, harassment. So it doesn't just fall from the sky. Basically, it's part of a context where you already have a lot of religious violence. And that is one finding that we found. We found that you can't really separate these allegations from broader contextual problems where there are situations of religious violence. We also saw that violence can occur in places where states really do enforce these blasphemy laws quite frequently and quite regularly. But also, violence can occur in situations where there is no blasphemy law, like in France, for example. You all might remember the attack against the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in 2015, when the journalists were deemed blasphemous, for example, but there's no blasphemy law in France, like in the US, but there was still violence. So sometimes you get violence and it's linked to state action, and sometimes you can get violence and it has nothing to do with the state, really. So that's why it's important, because it can happen in the US even if there's no blasphemy law. That's what I'm trying to say. But of course, if the state is enforcing the law, it can encourage mobs to take action because they feel that they have the support of the state, and they feel that the state is somehow behind them. And so the more a state enforces a law, the higher the probability there is for mobs to feel empowered and take justice into their own hands. So in terms of the laws themselves, now I have good news and bad news. So there have been some positive and negative developments when it comes to laws in general. Now, for example, on the negative side, we did take note, because the last time that I was looking at all these laws was in 2017. And then I looked at them again in 2020, and I was trying to see what the differences were. And I realized that new laws have entered into force in Oman, a Gulf state, in Mauritania as well, and in Morocco. So that's the bad news. And so in the case of Morocco and Oman, the maximum penalty has been substantially increased. So that's very unfortunate. And so in the case of Mauritania, it's joined Brunei, Iran, and Pakistan as the countries in the world with the death penalty for punishment for insult to religion. And so that is that is really an unfortunate development. Of course, there are countries like Saudi Arabia who implement Sharia laws, and that implementation can result in death penalty. But the problem is, because they don't have a formal written code, it all depends on the judge who interprets the Quran as the judge wants. And so sometimes it can be the death penalty, sometimes it can't. It's all very vague. And so, you can obviously include Saudi Arabia as one of the forms of judgment, but the other countries are Mauritania, Brunei, Iran, and Pakistan. On the positive side, there have been a series. Oh, sorry.
I need to make sure that I'm on the right slide if you need me to skip ahead.
Oh, yes. So it works now, or?
Yeah, can you see?
No, unfortunately, I haven't seen anything of the.
Oh, no. Well, I think everyone else can see.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So just tell me what slide. I'm on the anti-blasphemy laws slide with 4 bullet points. If you want me to skip ahead or.
So you know what? That's perfect. That's exactly where we should be. Thank you so much, Kelly. So, of course, on the positive side, there have been a series of repeals, which is great. There have been repeals from 9 different countries, mainly Western democracies. And so that is good. You might want to, no, you can leave it there. So despite these 9 repeals, and mainly they came from European liberal democracies, but they also came from Canada, New Zealand, and other places, we still have more laws now than we had in 2017. So, on one hand, it's good because some European liberal democracies and others, such as New Zealand and Canada, have repealed their laws because they realize that it's really hard, to go to a country and say, listen, there are so many different human rights abuses because of blasphemy allegations. And then the country can say, oh, but you also have your blasphemy law. So why are you giving us, lessons? So because of that, some laws were repealed, which is great, but there are still more laws than before. So now, Callie, maybe you can switch. So we also have a message from Lauren Doss.
I see that. Let's see.
So she can see the inbox, but not the PowerPoint. So Lauren, you went through the same thing as me. I couldn't.
Let me, you can keep talking. I'm going to try to screen share.
Yeah, no, definitely. So basically the next slide is just to give you an idea about where around the world you have, where are these 84 countries in the world that have blasphemy laws basically on the books. And so there are some that, some that just have criminal blasphemy laws, some that have laws, but we didn't find any cases. So that's something that, because we were looking it perfect. So you see here now, you see the PowerPoint. So you see in Russia, for example, it's in blue. In blue, it's countries with laws where we found cases, okay? And so you see, for example, we found 61 cases during 5 years, okay? Then in green, you have countries with laws, but we didn't find any cases. So for example, Brazil, it has a law, but during between 2014 and 2018, we didn't find any cases. And then you see in gray, for example, the United States, where there are no laws at all. And so, of course, if there are no laws, then we couldn't find any cases because it means the government didn't prosecute anyone for blasphemy or for insult to the sacred. So here you have a global idea of what's going on. And maybe you can change the slide now to the next one. And so the next slide, basically, we found 732 cases across 84 states. And that means basically, that means about 49% of the countries with criminal laws actually enforce it. And in 51% of those countries, we didn't find a single enforcement case. Of course, we were limited, and I'll speak about the limitations afterwards. We were limited language-wise as well. We didn't have access to these 84 languages in the world, and so there were limitations, but we did find 732 cases. Now, what are the trends? If Kelly can just change the slide to the next one, you'll see the leading trends. Okay, so these are the countries, these are the top 10 countries where there is the most enforcement. So you'll see that Pakistan, for example, has 24% of the world's enforcement, which is huge when you think about it. And so here you can really go through all the different things. Now, Iran, we did have access to Farsi. So in that sense, we were fortunate to be able to read the press, but hey, a lot of the cases are not reported in the press. So this is also something that you have to think about. Of course, in Pakistani media, which is mainly English, where there are a lot of, for example, Christian groups or Ahmadi groups who report a lot on blasphemy allegations. We used a lot of civil society information. It was in English. It's relatively open compared to other countries such as Iran or even Russia or Yemen. So we used basically what we could find. And so in that sense, the figures that we found are quite conservative because we only sort of researched on cases that were actually lucky, and I say that ironically, of course, lucky enough to be reported in the media, you see. So that's an important thing. You will notice, obviously, that that there are some, the region, Pakistan, South Asia is represented, the Gulf, the Middle East, Russia as well. Maybe Kelly can turn to the next page, and there you'll have a very visual, about the regional trends about this situation. So you see that, for example, the Middle East and North Africa constitute 35% of all different enforcement, Asia Pacific 49%, which is huge when you think about it. Very interesting, Latin America, no cases, 0%. That was a very interesting finding. And we see that in Africa, the enforcement are only 5%. So all of this was super interesting, very interesting finding. It also means, by the way, that 50% of the top 10 cases where there was the most enforcement concern the Middle East and the Gulf countries. So that's an important finding. And I think that, I think it's useful for you to see this visually like this, because you'll see immediately, where the trends are in terms of the regional distribution of cases. Now, if you move to the next slide, you'll see that we took a close look at violence. We couldn't ignore the phenomenon of violence. Of course, most of our research was based on enforcement. So it was based really on how, the police officers report, how the prosecutors conduct themselves, how the lawyers conduct themselves. But we couldn't deny the fact that there were many instances of violence out there in the streets that dealt also with blasphemy allegations. And so we did report 58 incidents of mob activity, violence, threats around blasphemers or their families, where there was state enforcement as well. So the state enforces a blasphemy law, and then the mobs are fired up, they feel entitled, they feel that they have the back of the state and law enforcement authorities because there has been an arrest or there has been somebody who's been thrown in prison. And so they take to the streets and they enforce also justice, and they take justice in their own hands, and there's violence. We were quite conservative in the way that we dealt with all of this, because there are many other countries and situations where you could have, for example, a general Islamist protest, and then there are calls to punish blasphemers, but it wasn't, it just happened organically. And so we didn't take those organic situations. We really took situations that were very limited to a specific case and where there were instances of violence. And I think that's important to, once again, to explain to you. Now, if you take the next slide, you'll see the different trends when it comes to that. So basically, nearly 80% of mob activity or violence or threats took place in only 4 countries, believe it or not. And those countries are Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Egypt. Now, those are the 4 countries where you have 80% of the violence. So I think it's very interesting. In Nigeria, the African state where there's the most violence, often the violence is targeted toward Christians. In Egypt, there is a lot of violence against all sorts of different minorities, whether they are Copts, whether they are Shia Muslims, whether they are free thinkers or atheists. There's also notable use of social media in Egypt, and there is a lot of call to violence on Facebook in Egypt, for example. So that is an interesting finding as well. The next slide. Now, we were wondering, who are the victims? You know, can we discover anything about these victims? And we did, you know, look when it was possible at the faith of the victim to see if there was a pattern. And actually, we noticed, first of all, we found out the origin, the faith of the accused blasphemer in about half of the cases, just so that you know. And within half of those cases where we did identify the religion, of those cases, Muslims accounted for more than 56% of the persons arrested, prosecuted, or punished for blasphemy allegations. And so I think this is really an important point, because often people who work on these issues are accused of being anti-Islam, or accused of, you know, that are holding a sort of agenda which is very Western oriented, and it's not the case. You know, clearly, you know, the figures speak for themselves. The largest victims are Muslims themselves. So this is not, you know, an anti-Islam crusade by the West you know, and so I think that that's a very important argument. The other groups that are frequently targeted, according to the information that we have, are Christians, 25%, atheists, 7%, Baha'i, 7%, and Hindu, 3%. It's very important to also realize that, you know, some religious communities are better or more capable of reporting than others, you know. So, for example, Muslim groups don't report that much. So the figure of 56% of Muslims being persecuted is probably higher. I'm not aware of, you know, a Buddhist organization that collects a lot of information on this, for example. So sometimes it can be underreported in certain cases, and I think that's an important element for you as well to bear in mind. If you, and of course, when we speak about Muslims, we often speak about Shia in Sunni majority countries, right? So just so that you know, that's probably often the case. Or it could be, for example, an Islamic thinker or an imam or an intellectual who has different philosophies or different interpretations of religion that goes against the state-sponsored religion. That's often the case as well. So it can also be Muslim intellectuals, for example, who are discussing, you know, a religious text and who disagree with the mainstream. So that's also a possibility. If you go to the next slide, we also wanted to know, what are the professions of these blasphemers? Can we decipher trends? You know, and so we actually saw that many of the accused are lawyers, academics, they're media professionals, sometimes they're religious figures who do not, as I was just saying, who dissent from the mainstream point of view. We found artists, we found political actors, including government officials sometimes who go against the stream. We found human rights activists. So these are the groups, but of course, you know, there are also farmers. You might recall Asia Bibi, who was a lady who was a farmer in Pakistan and who was also condemned, as she's now been freed after many, many years in prison. But she was a farmer. You know, you have all sorts of different groups, but we did see these trends in 674 cases. We found the majority, or we did find trends. So if you go to the next case, we also wanted to see how social media was, you know, being implicated in all of this. And we saw that Facebook is definitely the platform where there is the highest, there are most highest implications and accusations of blasphemy. And then you get to Twitter, and then VKontakte, which is a social media in Russia that actually I didn't know about at all, but it seems to be very prominent in Russia. And a lot of the cases that we found in Russia came from that social media as well. And the 10 countries with the highest number of reported cases implicating social media were Russia, precisely, Iran, Egypt, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Bahrain. And actually, we found that in over a quarter of all the cases we collected, 27%, in fact, there was social media was implicated. So that was also a huge finding. And it was a huge finding. Why? Because now, advocates, people such as yourselves who read this report, you can go to Facebook and you can say, listen, we have some stats about what happened between 2014 and 2018. And this is what happened. We found 80, I think it's 87, it's on the PowerPoint. We found 87 cases where Facebook was implicated. So please do something about it. And so this is also facts, obviously, and data also helps people a lot in their advocacy. And then finally, I would like to, if you can see that the different countries where there were extrajudicial violence that was implicated, there were cases of torture in the countries you will see below. There were due process violations in the cases to the right-hand side. All of this we've documented. We have the info. I don't know if you're particularly interested in Sri Lanka, we have the info on Sri Lanka, etc., etc. And so that's what I wanted to say. That's maybe it. And I think that what could be super interesting now is to take your questions, and thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Joelle. Okay, I'm going to switch.
The next, you can put the next email. Well, this is basically our limitations if you want. I don't know if you want me to get into that. Callie can always ask a question about that if she wants to. And then the next one is my email. So feel free to stay in touch. Feel free. These are the reports that I wrote. Feel free to
sorry about that.
Feel free to send me emails and ask me questions. Sorry, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I will, I definitely have some questions, but I'm happy to take those from others. If you raise your hand, I can call on you to ask your question in real time. You can also type in a question. And Joelle, is it okay for me to share your PowerPoint after the fact?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll share that with your email and everything, so folks can reach out. So while y'all determine if you're going to ask a question and raise your hand or type, I'll start. I was curious, Joelle, I was really glad that you got into, who tends to be the people that are reprimanded for blasphemy. But I'm curious to know if you studied it around gender lines, if there are more women that are accused of blasphemy versus men, or if it seems to be about equal, if there's anything you've seen on that front.
I think that's so interesting that you asked that question, because it was one of our indicators, and we wanted to, when we were coding the data, we wanted to know if there was any gender implications, and we didn't find anything interesting, to comment on, so we didn't really include it in the report. Okay. But there was a trend, for example, of female farmers who were quite illiterate, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, even Indonesia. I remember there were some important situations, but we didn't find any world trend where the stats could be interesting. So unfortunately, we didn't include it. But it doesn't mean that we can't in the future. It could be very interesting to, this is just one snapshot in time, and we could totally, go through it again and use, other pieces of information and do it in the future.
I would guess maybe that in some of these countries, women are not allowed to be as outspoken as they might be, and that might be part of it as well. I don't know.
Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, women maybe are just participating less in the public debate, and so as a result of that, we see them less. But there were some female journalists, for example, accused. That I do recall. I think it was in certain Gulf countries, the lady who presented the news or something, she was also accused of blasphemy.
Okay. So talking about social media, kind of where you ended the discussion, I'm curious to know, I mean, of course we can speak out against Facebook as a company, but I'm curious to know, like, I guess, because I think you have kind of classically liberal views about what should be allowed. Where do you think a company like Facebook or Twitter should draw the line, or should they? And what are do you have any specific recommendations for what should be done in a lot of these countries like Egypt, for example? Because I'm assuming Facebook is sometimes where the blasphemy is said, but also where the incitement to violence happens. So just tell us what you recommend.
So, of course, what I think is really sad is when, for example, if somebody speaks about religion freely on the internet and is surveyed by, when you're on Facebook, for example, you have this illusion of freedom. You have this illusion that you're comfortable sitting on your couch and you can say whatever you want and no one's watching. And in many countries, it's not the case. In many countries, you're being surveyed by your government, and that can have real ramifications for your personal security, offline and online, obviously. And so I think it would be very useful for Facebook not to collaborate with the governments who are trying to collaborate and to punish people on grounds of blasphemy. If you post that you don't believe in God on Facebook, and the government calls for your death penalty, Facebook should not be collaborating with that government. Now, and now at the same time, of course, free speech is very important, but free speech, even in incitement to imminent riot, is actually not allowed, even according to the very stringent US standards. And so it would be important also to make sure that calls to violence, because it happened in real time, for example, in Egypt. So, for example, somebody was accused of blasphemy, and then you had all these people tagging him, or somebody, all these people who were tagging him saying, oh, he's here, why don't we go and get him? We can go and attack him in the streets. And so the violence online went offline. And that was, and that is extremely dangerous. And so these are the kind of situations where I think Facebook should really be sure not to enable people to be attacked. And then there were, some absurd situations where, for example, somebody was accused of liking a post. And during the trial proceedings, the person said, oh, no, but I didn't like that post. Someone used my profile and liked it, but I didn't like it. There are all sorts of absurd situations, and unfortunately, people have a full sense of security online, and they think that they can do things that that will go unnoticed in real life, but unfortunately, it's not the case.
Well, I have many more questions, but y'all feel free to chime in, folks. I wanted to ask you about, there were a couple countries that stood out to me, because obviously most of the countries on these top 10 lists in your presentation are Muslim majority countries, but Russia and India, and I know India has a very large Muslim population, I think maybe second only after Bangladesh, right, in terms of pure numbers. But I was really curious to hear more about Russia, India, and then I saw Spain pop up a few times on some of your lists. So maybe you could dive into some specific examples of things that you track in those countries that maybe, to me, they stood out. So I'm just curious to hear more.
Yeah, they were definitely very interesting findings for us. And so we saw, for example, in the case of Russia, we saw that there were many accusations of blasphemy in the context of cultural events. So it was all about, museums and culture and literature and, and the church and the state trying to enforce its vision of what art should be, and so a lot of art was accused of being blasphemous and irrespectful to religion and being insulting. And so that was definitely a finding, because it wasn't, about politics or the political manipulation of religion. In different contexts, for example, in South Asia, it was really about what are the boundaries of artistic expression, and I felt that was a big deal in Russia. India, the situation is getting worse, definitely. So it's really hard to see. India also has the same system of collecting information as Pakistan. So, you have to make first information reports, and they had the same, judicial procedure, which enables them to collect cases in a very, how do you say, a big way, where there's a lot of quantities, a lot of a lot of information. So the data collection there is similar to Pakistan, but the situation is getting worse, and there's more and more religious intolerance, for sure, between Hindus and Muslims. So that is definitely.
You see that the blasphemy laws in India are really only targeted towards Muslims or towards Hindus and Sikhs, and just across the board there's less tolerance, or is it less tolerance in one group of people?
I think I would have to double check with you. I would have to double check with you the stats and see what is the proportion of the Muslims who are accused of blasphemy in India, or could it be, could it also be other minorities as well? That's something that I definitely could check for you and get back to you.
And what about Spain? What's going on in Spain?
No, Spain, I think Spain, it was just one, prominent case that kept on, cropping up. Yeah, I mean, it's always surprising, when Europeans enforce their law. The Spaniards did at one point. It did hit the headlines at some point in some European countries, but there isn't any violence attached to it. So the situation is different in that sense, but of course it's still a law that shouldn't exist because it doesn't really correspond to Spanish modern society, but it's still there, and it's still being enforced.
Can you tell us about that law? I'm curious.
Oh, if you click on the report, you will see all the list of laws. Okay. So you can see very quickly, what are the laws, and the cases as well, and everything. So we've put all of this into the report.
Okay. I found it curious that when you broke in that pie chart that broke down these cases by religion, and of course Islam being at the top, and then I think followed by Christianity, I did not see Judaism, or we haven't even mentioned anti-Semitism during this conversation. I'm just curious to know, what were your findings on that? Is it just it's a smaller number of people, so it's just smaller incidences? And I know in Europe this is a growing issue, so I'm just curious to know.
Well, yes, no, absolutely. This blasphemy is just one form of intolerance, and it so happens that Jews are quite good at reporting human rights abuses that concern them across the world. They've reported on hate crimes a lot. They've reported on anti-Semitic content, conspiracy theories, all sorts of things, but they're not accused of blasphemy, right. And so that's only what it means. It doesn't mean that they don't suffer religious persecution. They just don't suffer religious persecution on grounds of blasphemy in these countries.
That makes sense. That was a brain fart on my part, but
no. I think it's very important, because this is just one phenomenon of many different phenomenons of religious intolerance around the world. So it's one aspect that can trigger it's extensive violence in some parts of the world, but in other parts of the world, religious persecution take very different forms. And I think it's very important to stress that this is not the full picture at all.
And then just to kind of wind us up, well, two things. Just in terms of your research, is this research ongoing? Will you be revisiting this every couple of years to see what the trends are? What are you working on now?
Well, now I am working on promoting the report. Unfortunately, it came out just before the US presidential elections. So in terms of promotion, it wasn't great, because so many other things were on the Americans' minds. And so, what with Corona and the US elections and all this stuff, it wasn't the best time. So slowly the information is trickling out, which is great. Of course, I would love to continue working on this, depending on if it's possible. I'm working on other issues right now. I'm working on a toolkit on freedom of religion or belief for diplomats around the world, how they can apprehend these kind of questions, but also all sorts of other different conflicts that stem from religion, because as we said before, you know, blasphemy is one thing, but there are hate crimes, and there are conspiracy theories, and there are all sorts of other instances of violence that are not necessarily linked to blasphemy. But religion is often a source of you know, of conflict between peoples, and so there's still a lot to do to explain to people their rights, but also their responsibilities when it comes to free speech and freedom of thought, and this inherent right of each one to believe whatever he or she wants, as long as it doesn't, you know, incite to violence against another person. And yeah, I'm quite involved in politics at the moment in Geneva. So I'm a member of the Geneva Parliament. So it's taking a lot of my time because I'm not used to it. It's quite new, so it's taking a lot of my energy. And that's it. You know, I think I'm allowed to go back to travel to the US. So hopefully we can meet in person next time.
Yes. Well, I think as of later this week, Europeans are able to come here. So
yeah, that would be wonderful. So I very much hope that next time we can do this in person.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I will share this with all of our members and have it. Is it okay to post this talk on our website?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can tag me and I'll post it as well.
Wonderful.
Great pleasure.
Thank you so much. I think this is such a fascinating topic, and I'm glad that we got to dive into it with you. And I will, I'm sure you'll have some follow-up questions coming your way.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your kind invitation. I really appreciate it. And it's really wonderful to reconnect again.
You too. We'll be in touch.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.